For me, that is the danger, that technocratic mindset still being blissfully unaware of the consequences, of political consequences, of a number of agendas that Europe continues to pursue.
Herewith, a double paradox. The European Union's set of founding principles, its telos, so to speak, are undergoing a two-track inversion. The bloc was initially designed to slide gently towards federalization, whilst remaining a largely toothless actor on the world stage. And yet, the opposite has happened. The EU has since grown into a powerful geopolitical player of its own that is internally at peace with the present deadlock of integration. Sometime between the eurozone crisis of the early 2010s and Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine, the EU's entire architecture has been turned inside out. Scholars, journalists, and analysts in Brussels and European capitals are still at pains to gauge the depth of this complete revolution. Stefan Auer of Hong Kong University may have lost some sleep over it. A former and likely future recipient of the prestigious Jean Monnet Chair for EU Studies, he is as astute an observer as any of the bloc's institutional dynamics, and he argues in his most recent book that instead of seeking to transcend the laws of politics, the EU would be well advised to heed them instead. In this episode, he sits down with us and Glyn Morgan, associate professor at Syracuse University's politics department. Now, as always, please rate and review Uncommon Decency on Apple Podcasts and send us your comments or questions either on Twitter or by email. And please consider supporting the show on Patreon.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation on the European Union. I want to start with you, Stefan. In 2000, Jean Monnet mordantly asked in a book about German intellectual life around unification, can one say that if Europe works, Carl Schmitt is wrong? Now, for the uninitiated or the unfamiliar with Weimar political theorist, Carl Schmitt essentially argued that conflict was a key part of human nature and therefore its politics. What exactly about the EU's functioning disproves the Schmittian view of politics? And is that anti-Schmittian essence being put to the test by the return of war to the European continent?
Yes, absolutely. It's been put to a test. One of the key ambitions that has driven the European project was to overcome conflicts. And as you said, from Schmittian perspective, that means really overcoming politics. And this is because for Schmitt, conflict is the defining feature of the politics. He writes about the political, that is that special sphere of human existence that's defined by conflicts. And it is one of those things that Schmitt is famous for. And it is in this sense that the EU was set out to prove Schmitt wrong. It was a profoundly anti-Schmittian project. It was meant to serve as an example for the world, right? And when you think of the kind of foundational myth of European unity, if you want, the possibility of Franco-German reconciliation, which has worked, right? Then it is seemingly in defiance of that emphasis on friend and enemy distinction that Schmitt thought was so important. So, and why do we say now that it's no longer the case? So I think that globally, in particular, the EU was meant to be anti-geopolitical, post-sovereign, post-conflictual. It was meant to embody what scholars enthusiastically refer to as a soft power Europe, right? The power of example. This was the Europe that was going to rule the 20th century, as one of the book titles had it like 20 years ago. It was a Europe that would secure peace in the world through conversation, right? And that Europe was not to be. That Europe was a delusion, I believe. The delusion itself was only made possible thanks to the US security umbrella, and there the European attitude towards the US is quite odd, right? Because there is a lot of snobbery traditionally amongst European elites. You know, they consider Americans retrograde and vulgar because they still speak the language of power. Europe was meant to have moved beyond that world, and that I think proved a massive delusion, particularly in confrontation with Russia, particularly in relation to Ukraine. I think the tragedy of Ukraine was that it found itself in that kind of gray zone, right? And while the EU construes itself as a post-political, post-geopolitical power, of course, Putin's Russia is anything but that, and that meant that the EU was attractive enough for Ukraine to for Ukrainians to aspire for EU membership, but the EU was not strong enough to effectively support Ukraine in its fight for national sovereignty and the preservation of national sovereignty.
Glyn, would you like to bounce in there?
Yes, no, here is an area in where I agree with Stefan in many ways. I think that it is certainly true that there has been a certain naivete by many European scholars in hoping that European Union would represent the transcendence of politics, and the old geopolitical conflicts would somehow disappear. That hasn't proven to be the case. Stefan is quite right, and I think it is silly to expect it to disappear. But I draw a rather different conclusion than he does. I think that the European Union needs to live in a world of conflict, and it needs to prepare itself. And I think it is better prepared, or has the potential to be better prepared to live in this new world than a world of nation states.
And I think that kind of brings us to what has been one of the main driving forces for European integration over the past decades. To a large extent, it was obviously politics, but also to kind of maybe an equal extent, I guess that's part of the question, through law and judges. And Hans Kelsen, the very famous Austrian legal scholar, really theorized before World War II that Europe could integrate through law. And to a large extent, what we saw in the 1960s especially is what would become the European Court of Justice, becoming this force for integration, making judicial decisions which create a lot of conflict with national courts, but also with national governments, which in a sense created kind of de facto constitutional level without actually having a political decision to have some kind of constitutional equivalence. Can you maybe walk us through, Stefan, through this integration through law and perhaps how the tensions it created for the 1960s onward?
Yeah, so I mean, we can even continue in that with that notion of the EU as an anti-Schmittian concept, because the law within the EU is almost a substitute for politics, right? And that is something that Carl Schmitt would consider like both the kind of normatively wrong, but also not viable. And I cite Hans Kelsen. He obviously was the most formidable opponent of Carl Schmitt, but in relation to European integration, there is another leading kind of scholar of law and legal integration who himself was a practitioner. He was the first president of the European Commission. I'm talking about Walter Hallstein.
Yeah.
And he coined the notion, a German notion that proved actually remarkably successful. And the German notion is the Europäische Rechtsgemeinschaft, which is not easily translated into English. Because
as German really is, to be honest.
Well, yes, it's a compound word, but it's worth pondering its meaning, because it really then the theory of integration through law very much is based, I think, on that German understanding of the role that law could play in the process of European integration. So the compound word consists of two words: Recht, which is law, but in German it's not just law; it's also kind of an ideal of justice, right? Recht is a good kind of law. And Gemeinschaft, it's more than just society. Gemeinschaft is more than just Gesellschaft, which is a German word for society. It is a kind of community that shares a certain purpose, even certain ideals. So you can see that kind of sense of idealism embedded in that word. So through law, law then fulfills dual purpose. It serves as an instrument of integration, but it is also ultimately also an aim of integration, and that is what actually eventuated, right? That we ended up with a Europe that is ruled by one system of law, right? There is such a thing now as EU law, and that holds the whole thing together. And that has its advantages, I don't want to deny it, but it also has major weaknesses, major shortcomings, because it ultimately depoliticizes a number of highly contentious political issues, and to that extent, it also actually erodes democracy, particularly democracies at national level. So that's my kind of problem. But there is a vast literature on integration through law. There is interesting kind of revisionist literature coming out more recently that challenges this assumption that it was quite a smooth process, right? There was much more kind of pushback against it than is often assumed. But roughly, I suppose, I would be curious to hear Glyn's perspective on this story.
Glyn, do you say genau to what Stefan has just said, or do you have some quibble?
Yeah, I agree with much of what he said. Going back to this idea of integration through law, if you'd have asked people in the 1950s whether it would be possible to bring eventually 27 or 28 countries together under a common legal system that would be able to regulate a huge tranche of issues of the greatest importance to European people, I think most people would have been very skeptical, think, never work. I mean, it's impossibly utopian to think that you could use law to achieve such a ambitious project. But I think it worked. I mean, the integration through law has actually achieved an astonishing amount in the European Union. And the question, though, becomes, can we rest on our laurels here, or do we need to move to other mechanisms of integration? And I fear that we are about at the end of the stage where we can rely wholly on law. But two just additional points. One, I think that you can see in the Brexit process just what a form of treacle, as it were, the law represents. It's extremely difficult to get out of it. And European law has worked its way into so many different areas. It's extraordinarily difficult to get out of it. Last point is that the reliance on law is not solely a phenomenon of the European Union. I think in late modern societies, we are seeing so many of issues move from the political realm into the legal realm. I'm living in the United States, and so many of the issues that divide us are settled at the Supreme Court level. And I think that is something that Europeans need to realize, that the role of the law is not to be wholly understood solely in terms of European phenomenon. It's something to do with late modernity.
Absolutely. Stefan, do you want to bounce back?
Yeah, just very briefly, again, I agree with Glyn, and I also agree emphatically that is a global phenomenon. But my argument would be that the EU is make this global problem worse. And the problem that we are trying to describe is the kind of juridification of politics. So Christian Jürges, a brilliant German scholar of European constitutionalism, talks about European economic constitution, when you see that certain provisions are in place that make that massively constrain economic policies within member states, right? And that is a serious problem for democracy at national level, and that problem became much more pronounced, of course, during the eurozone crisis. So I agree with Glyn that the problem is global, and the United States is a good example of that problem also. But I think the European level brings another dimension to it. There is another practical aspect to it, and that is that it is next to impossible to change EU provisions. You need unanimity, right? So there are a number of provisions in place that have a quasi-constitutional status, which would, in other kind of normal, regular democracies, be open to political contestation, but within EU, they are almost impossible.
Okay, can you give examples, Stefan?
Well, the European Economic Constitution is one of those examples. The Maastricht Treaty has very clear kind of rules on how much you can spend in any given years, how much debt you can take. And these rules have been violated for decades now, but that doesn't disprove my point, right? I mean, the repeated violation of rules is also not good for the rule of law state, which the EU has the aspiration to be. So, yeah, but any number of areas are regulated in minute detail, and many of those regulations basically have a quasi-constitutional status. Dieter Grimm, a former judge of the German Constitutional Court, wrote about that problem extensively, and I share his views on that. It erodes democracy in Europe, I believe.
And because I think that kind of gets to the center thesis of your new book, Stefan, which is that the difficulties within the EU's are the product of its drive to go beyond the age of nation states. But at the same time, how do you kind of square this? How do you make sense of the EU? Because at the same time, there is this kind of federalist drive going on, but equally, nation states remain largely in the driver's seat. And most of the efforts for actually integration over the past few years or so, especially with COVID, actually went through the European Council. They went through the proposals of heads of state like Macron. How do you kind of make sense of the EU? Who really holds the potestas and maybe the auctoritas as well? Who has the power in the EU? And how has this balance of power changed? You think has changed in the past few years or so? Starting with Stefan, and then we'll circle back to Glyn.
Well, for me, that is one of the key problems, and I see it as the dysfunction of the EU system of governance. I mean, even that term, you see, that we have to use. The EU doesn't have a government, it has a system of governance. So the answer to your question, like who is in charge, well, nobody knows. And when you look at EU literature, and textbooks about the EU, that tends to be celebrated. A constitutional scholar once described this phenomenon, like the member states lose sovereignty, no one else gains it. So he says it's like virginity. You lose it without anyone else gaining it, and that's something to be celebrated. I am doubtful about the phenomenon being positive, because I think for a democracy, you need to know who is in charge. And so with the EU, it depends. You are right to say that a number of major decisions are usually taken in the EU Council, and that means that the member states are in the driving seat. That is even consistent with the EU treaties, because the member states are in German, die Herren der Verträge. That is, they are the masters of the treaties, right? The EU Commission is the guardian of the treaties. But when you think of key moments in which difficult decisions had to be taken, and those key moments in times of crisis, again, remind me of Schmidt's understanding of sovereignty and power, right? He asked that difficult question, who is in charge? He said that the one who decides on the exception is sovereign. And to answer that question within the EU is quite difficult. So it very much depends on what kind of situation they face, what kind of crisis. So when you think of the eurozone crisis, Mario Draghi was the one who ultimately is meant to have saved the whole thing by saying that he will do whatever it takes to safeguard the eurozone. And that is definitely not the role that the European Central Bank was given in the Maastricht Treaty, right? It was meant to be an apolitical body, and there you have basically a banker, a central banker, deciding on the fate of Greece, having an important role then in determining social policies of a member state like Greece. So it massively eroded democracy in Europe, I believe, the Eurozone crisis, right? And then when it comes, of course, to foreign affairs and security policy, now in dealings with Russia or China, Olaf Scholz is just visiting Beijing as we speak. The member states suddenly have more input, right? And ultimately, I believe, are in the driving seat, as you said. I don't bemoan that, but I think basically my problem is that, or where I differ from many mainstream scholars of European integration, that this is an article of faith, that the EU is a fascinating experiment in transnational or post-national governance in which member states share sovereignty for a greater good, etc. I believe this story is credible and has worked well in good times, had worked well in good times. In times of crisis, I don't think it works. It exposes the dysfunction of the EU system of governance, and then you have random actors like whether it's Angela Merkel, the former Chancellor of Germany, or Mario Draghi, who call the shots, and many people and voters feel disempowered.
Glyn, any thoughts?
Well, I agree with part of what Stefan was saying there. It's, I think, in theory, the power in the European Union does lie with the European Council. In practice, it doesn't lie with the European Council if we think of it as 27 states. In practice, European power lies with Germany, France, in recent years, Britain, occasionally Italy. And it really is dominated by those 3 or 4 countries, France and Germany in particular. It depends a little bit upon the personality of the politician in question. I don't think anyone thinks that Olaf Scholz has the same degree of power that Angela Merkel had. But and I also agree with Stefan that to talk about post-national government, transnational government, is a little bit of a misnomer given the domination by 3 or 4 countries. Now, the interesting question going forward is this structure one that can solve the major problems that are going to confront Europe in the next 20 years? And I think that Stefan thinks that the current structure is not fit for purpose and would like to return to a more sovereign Europe. Whereas I think that the problems that are going to come down the path are not ones that 27 independent nation states can handle, and that we will need to move to a more centralized European Union. And this is particularly the case, I think, in foreign military and security policy. But there's a bunch of other ones too, which I think also call for more centralization.
We will definitely go back to the kind of idea of a European superstate down the road, but let's go to Stefan.
Yeah, you might have misspoke, Glyn, because I said that I advocate a sovereign Europe, right? If anything, I suppose I advocate for more repatriation of sovereign powers towards member states. But I think, now our conversation is becoming more interesting because what we have in common is that we would like to think openly about power and how it matters, right, on where it is. So I agree that the way in which that entity has worked, it has been dominated by major member states. But so when we look at the current challenge, the biggest challenge, Russia, of course, the more assertive, aggressive Russia and its war against Ukraine, I find it quite revealing that, yes, when it comes to economic sanctions, the EU has played an important role. Yes, when it comes to dealing with a massive influx of refugees, the EU has played an important role in creating a regulatory framework that makes that, a manageable challenge. But when it comes to the fundamental existential challenge to Ukraine and Europe, and that is how to stand up to that aggressive Russia, nation states, NATO members play an important role, right? Not the EU. This is where it's kind of ridiculous in a tragic way when you have Josep Borrell threatening Putin that if he was to resort to nuclear weapons, his army would be annihilated. That Borrell is in no position to make such statements, right? It really just exposes the EU's impotence when the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policies make statements like that. What matters is like powerful nation states who are willing to make these commitments to Ukraine. Poland matters, the United Kingdom matters, right? I wish that Germany would pull its weight too, but Germany actually what it does, and this is where I find the EU's role somewhat pernicious, Germany is hiding behind the EU. It's hiding its unwillingness or insufficient willingness to support Ukraine behind the EU. But when you look at the players who have made difference from day one, it's the United Kingdom, It's the United States. Far away Australia probably has done more than some of the major European countries, right? So in the kind of challenges that, when it comes to the kind of existential challenge, right, the question of war and peace, nation states matter a great deal. They need to work together, of course. NATO is an organization that brings all these nation states together, but nobody is going to die for the EU, and I don't even think it's such a bad thing, probably, you know.
Glyn?
I completely disagree about this, because here is, I think, the major error with Stefan's perspective, that he portrays people who write on the EU as naive and not realizing where power is, and then holds up NATO as this great alternative. But that view bespeaks a tremendous naivete about NATO. NATO is an asymmetrical military alliance based on US power. United Kingdom and Poland had a marginal contribution to the war effect in Ukraine. Ukraine is being saved, A, by the heroism of the Ukrainians fighting against Russia, and B, by US military power. If you look at the contribution of weaponry to Ukraine, it is overwhelmingly US. I mean, the contribution of the UK and Poland is minuscule. If the Ukrainians had to rely on the UK and Poland, they would have been crushed months ago. And the problem that the Europeans face is that NATO itself is extremely fragile, because the likely next president of the United States, President Donald Trump, wants to bring about the end of NATO. And I don't think Europeans, and I include here Stefan, have really come to terms with the fact that the United States is experiencing a wave of anti-democratic populist isolationism, and that Europe is dependent for its security on the United States via this asymmetrical military alliance, NATO.
Yes. So I do not want to speak now in defense of NATO. That's not what I try to suggest. It is just to say that the EU, the way it is currently governed, with all its dysfunctions on which we agreed, would be in no position to replicate NATO's functions, right? We would need a very different EU, and that is something that I think we can have a fruitful discussion about, but it wouldn't be this kind of post-national, post-political, post-geopolitical Europe that then suddenly has an army. I mean, I think that is where I'm in full agreement with the Polish Prime Minister, Morawiecki, who pointed out that if the EU already had, for example, abandoned unanimity requirement in foreign affairs and security policies, and its position would then have been dominated by Germany, Ukraine would have received almost no support, right, from Europeans. It would have received support from the US and the UK, and in that sense, it might not have made that much difference. But I agree with Glyn that if Ukraine was to depend just on the UK and Poland, it might not have existed. But if it was to depend on the EU, the chance of it, succeeding against Russia would have been even smaller. And this is where I find the EU's role really pernicious. That is, by creating this kind of gray zone, NATO has its responsibility to the United States, but even in terms of proximity and the geopolitical importance of Ukraine, the EU's role, I think this kind of anti-post-political, post-geopolitical position it adopted proved hugely dangerous. Like the EU was unaware of its power, right? Its very existence created a situation that the EU didn't take kind of responsibility for.
I think we have one last question on maybe the state of the EU before we kind of start looking forward of what the EU's future in the next few years look like. But I think, Julian, you had one last question on nowadays.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, when we sort of look back at the last decade and a half of European geopolitics and domestic politics, 2008 financial crisis, sovereign debt crises, in many European economies, the refugee crisis, then COVID hit, and now we have the war in Ukraine. I just wanted to ask both of you how that has changed the mindset in Brussels and the conversation on the EU, and how have those priorities and reflexes adapted to these new post-crisis environments. And then one specific thing I would like to ask is how it's also changed the role of the Commission president. The old Kissinger saying was, who do I call when I want to call Europe? And increasingly, there's a sense that it's Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. I'll start with Glyn, and then we'll turn it over to you, Stefan.
Well, I have rather a cynical view of the mindset in Brussels, because every time I ever talk to bureaucrats in Brussels, I'm always struck with how much they see the world through rose-coloured spectacles. They're very reluctant to criticise what they do or see any weaknesses. And they're very reluctant to change. I think many people in Brussels seem to think they're sitting upon the world's most perfect system of government and that there isn't much to worry about. But I mean, I don't think, moving on to the second part of your question, that Ursula von der Leyen is a very strong person. I think that she was put there by people who wanted to maintain power in the hands of the European nation states, namely Germany and France. And I don't really see much of what the Commission does as very important or significant.
And Stefan, I'll add another point to Julian's question. I think one other crisis, I'm the one who drafted this question, but one thing I definitely forgot, so I'm not blaming on Julian, is actually Brexit. I think Brexit is another one of these crises that we should add on top of those other ones listed. How has it kind of changed the mindset in Europe?
I mean, I don't consider Brexit a major crisis because, for me, the UK is just attempting to reclaim control over its destiny, and I'm okay with that. I mean, it is a crisis for the EU to the extent that one of the prosperous member states left because it felt that it could not, successfully fight for its interests within that project. My sense is, and that is where I probably agree with Glyn, that not much is changing in Brussels. I suspect that the main reflex in Brussels remains the same. Whatever the question, more Europe is the answer, right? There seems to be a growing realization that the world outside of Europe is changing. Josep Borrell just gave this controversial speech about Europe being a garden, and out there the world is wild, right? I mean, the image was wrong, but it is indicative of the perception that things are changing. But I also have the experience that Glyn just mentioned. I actually debated a fellow who is an EU diplomat here in Brussels, and he talked to Hong Kong students about environmental issues, and then he advanced an idea that I found absurd, but really coming out from this technocratic mindset. One of the stories that Europeans love telling themselves is that crisis is always an opportunity, and historically there is something to it, right? That when there were difficulties, economic difficulties or migration crisis or whatnot, Europeans came together and came up with a solution. But he applied the same logic to the war in Ukraine, saying that it is a fantastic opportunity for Europeans to accelerate the green transition, the reduction of CO2 emissions and the greenhouse effect, etc., which I found absurd, right? Like, firstly, it completely it presents this horrible war in Ukraine as a background to a marvelous, uplifting European story, but it also ignores the political reality of that green energy transition. Like, Germans have been leaders of that agenda. And that very agenda actually led them to massively strengthen their dependency on Putin's Russia, even after the occupation of Crimea. So there you have a kind of seemingly noble political goal, green energy transition, transformed into some kind of technocratic task that is then pursued through these apolitical means. And then people seem blissfully unaware of the catastrophic political impact of that policy when you think that the modernization of Russian army was largely financed by the income, that Germans bought so much gas and oil from Russia even after the invasion of Crimea. So for me, that is the danger, that technocratic mindset still being blissfully unaware of the consequences, of political consequences, of a number of agendas that Europe continues to pursue, and not connecting the dots, not thinking about political consequences, not thinking about the real power that a country like Germany has with decision pursued through EU.
We'll be moving on now to the second half of our conversation, which is kind of more forward-looking on the EU. This will be our patron section. Thank you so much for both of you for this fantastic overview of this long-going intellectual, friendly but intellectual feud between both of you for the past few years. Very interesting conversation on the state of the EU and how maybe you see it progress in the years to come. Stefan, thank you so much. All the best for your upcoming, your recently published book, European Disunion, and thank you so much, Glyn, for coming along for this passionate conversation on the EU.
Thanks for the kind invitation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stefan and Glyn are both out. It is just myself and Francois now on what was a very lively discussion about the European Union, European politics. So, Francois, just high-level takeaways. What did you think?
Yeah. Well, first of all, this is an episode that has been a long time in the making. We actually reached out to Stefan a year ago when we were planning an episode on the European rule of law and the conversation on the kind of primacy of EU law. And he very gracefully actually told us to invite one of his colleagues, Nikos Kluner, who was a fantastic guest with Paul Craig, and made for a very, very lively episode as well. But Stefan told us, it's not that I don't want to come. I thought she's more qualified to do this episode. However, I'm going to publish a book. Invite me then. And he said, and when you invite me, I want you to have me alongside Glyn Morgan, which is my intellectual arch enemy, and we've been squabbling about those questions for a very long time. So we gracefully obliged, and we did that today, and it was a very, very lively conversation. I think kind of the crux of the conversation going on here is, to some extent, nobody uses that term anymore, but the kind of democratic deficit conversation, saying, is there the kind of legitimacy, the democratic legitimacy for the EU to take on larger decisions? And it's not an easy question. There's a lot of back and forth going on. And, I went back to the conversation at the very start on the rule of law and how the courts, to a large extent, drove European integration. And as Stefan rightly points out, it was a tough battle between different judges across different countries. Fundamentally, I think the idea of the EU was to create, through small steps, a solidarity which meant that it couldn't be unraveled. That's the idea between the original creation of what would later become the EU, which was to make sure that the steel and coal markets of France and Germany would be so intertwined that war would be impossible. But the thing is, you can only go so far with this kind of small steps before at some point the people feel like they need to have a say in all of this and decide. And this is where the issue comes, and where I think it's very interesting to get Glyn's perspective, where he says, we've gone too far in the kind of technocratic aspect of the EU. I think at some point it's important, it's healthy that the people give their input on the EU, because if you want the EU to have this kind of demos, this kind of European political identity, you need to have those debates. You will lose some, undeniably, but if you don't have them, it's simply going to create a lot of tension, and that tension is manifesting itself in many cases with the rise of populist, far-right, and sometimes very anti-EU parties. So, yeah, I think fundamentally the crux is how can we make this European project without at some point getting democratic input and respecting national identities, which are not going to disappear overnight, of course.
It's quite a fascinating dilemma or paradox of European integration, in that it requires the buy-in of the public, and yet so many of the debates happen without a democratic mandate or without popular consent or without public debate about some of those critical issues. Just thinking back to 2016, which obviously we have discussed here on this podcast, and also just knowing each other at the time when it happened, it was really Britain's first chance to debate its relationship with Europe since the 1970s. The Lisbon Treaty was not put to a referendum in the United Kingdom, despite the seismic changes it had on British law. And it was in part because of a fear that actually turned out to be right on the part of the Europhiles, that if the British people were offered a vote on a matter of European integration, they would vote no.
And the paradox in all of this is the fierce Brexit debate, which in many ways actually was just as fierce after the referendum as it was before the referendum, actually to some extent created a European political culture in Britain. There's a kind of whole generation of people, the kind of Romaniacs or, strong Remainers who essentially got very much accustomed with the EU, with its institutions, and more largely the British public all of a sudden, because of the difficulties of the negotiations, but also the whole referendum campaign, really started understanding the very complex institutional network of the EU in a way that maybe few Europeans actually do. Yeah, I was saying, they paradoxically, this referendum and the debates that followed, they created a political culture, British political culture, which ended up being much more attuned to the complexities and to the nuances of what's going on in the EU. And, that's the real paradox of the Brexit debate.
You only start paying attention to the thing once you miss it, is the lesson I'm getting here. It was one of the questions in Prime Minister's Questions the other day, was about Scotland's rightful place in Europe from an SNP MP.
Yeah, I think there's something else going on in the conversation, which is Ukraine. And again, we're talking about how the lack of a European political demos is kind of so central to the headaches about the EU. And what was going on in Ukraine is quite interesting, because there is, again, this blending of kind of liberalism and nationalism going on, which we haven't seen since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Cold War, and since maybe 1848 in Western Europe. But it's very interesting to see how it kind of creates a narrative, a function, a mission, a enemy for the EU. Maybe in some ways we're going back to Schmittian politics by creating this kind of enemy, which creates a kind of common cause.
Yes, it's funny. Conflict does have a way of either binding people together or tearing them apart. In some ways, the story of US integration among the states has been accelerated. I'm not talking, this is post-Civil War I'm talking about, before I get jumped on by American historians. The power of the state was increased most by the crisis of the Depression and then the Second World War. And, I hear people talking about the military-industrial complex without even knowing that they're thinking it. But that's sort of what accelerated a lot of the development of the US state as an integrated polity. Even the First World War as well accelerated that integration of the states. And there was, I guess, some expectation that Europe would follow a similar path. Strategic autonomy had been discussed prior to the invasion of Ukraine, as this podcast has covered frequently. But, as was pointed out by our guests, there is a sense among some observers of Europe that European countries don't actually want to take responsibility for their own security. I mentioned it during the episode, but if you're ranking the three biggest givers of military aid as individual states to Ukraine, it goes the United States, the United Kingdom, Poland, and then it's followed up by Germany and Canada. As a percentage of GDP, it's primarily Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Lithuania, Norway who are giving the most as a share of their GDP. So the big hitters in Europe are not embracing this new opportunity for a security role for Europe and a security role for the European Union.
I would just say this about France. France is very uncomfortable about publishing the aid it sends to Ukraine, which is why they often perhaps come up as kind of dragging their feet when a lot of the help they send is under the radar. They'd rather not publicize it too much. But yes, we haven't been on the level of the United States for sure, and the UK, and even kind of in relative terms, Poland and some countries in the Baltic.
There's one thing I would actually add, because Glyn mentioned it when talking about what was sort of winning the war in Ukraine, and I think this is an element where perhaps Europe could define itself differently from NATO in terms of security assistance. If you look at the conflict on the ground, yes, US military aid is absolutely indispensable, but a lot of the military advances that the Ukrainians are making are not using big hitting weaponry. A lot of it is simple, low cost weaponry that you can get from other countries, including the TB2 drone from Turkey, which we have talked about, but also the availability of Starlink in Ukraine. We don't yet know what impact that's having on the battlefield, but it's certainly been a positive one. And then lastly, there are numerous videos out there that you can find of Ukrainian troops using a drone that you would buy off of Amazon to hit Russian ammo depots.
Yeah.
That is not a high-tech piece of equipment. It is not a high-cost piece of equipment, but it is having a market effect on the battlefield.
Great. Well, special thank for our two guests for coming. We talked a lot about Stefan's book, European Disunion, but there's an older book which was published by Glyn, which is quite interesting and created quite a conversation. The idea of a European superstate, public justification and European integration, which he published back in 2006 or 2007, I believe, which is a very interesting conversation for those who want to think what a European superstate would look like. Okay, thank you so much for both of our guests for coming on the show. And if you want to listen to the full conversation we had, mainly on the future of EU and maybe a European superstate, you need to join us on our Patreon, where we have these wonderful extra long conversations and in-depth conversation following the main part of the content. Okay, thank you so much, Julian, and see you next week.